The night was heavy with rain, the kind of downpour that seemed to wash away all traces of life from the streets of Busan. The neon lights glistened on the wet pavement, casting long, distorted reflections of the world above. Yet, the city continued its rhythm, as busy and alive as ever, while the rain poured relentlessly. The air felt damp and thick, as though it carried with it the weight of something ominous. A group of young workers huddled together, their clothes drenched, but their faces filled with hope. For them, this rainy night was not a barrier, but an opportunity. The factory had given them a chance, a rare chance for steady work, a chance to escape their current circumstances. They had heard nothing of the factory's dark past. To them, it was just another job, one they could use to support their families, pay off debts, or just make ends meet. The promise of good pay and regular hours had been enough to draw them in. They didn't question the location or the whispers they had heard from those who passed by the factory. After all, most people who came from outside the area didn't know about the cursed building. It was just another piece of history to them, another industrial relic of Busan's past. The workers had no reason to believe otherwise. As they stood at the entrance of the factory, the heavy rain soaking their clothes and making the ground beneath them slick, they felt a collective sense of nervous excitement. This was it. They would be starting new jobs, earning money, and hopefully beginning a new chapter in their lives. They approached the entrance cautiously, hesitant but driven by necessity. One of them, a young man named Jiho, pushed open the creaky door. A sound echoed through the factory's empty halls, a sharp contrast to the steady downpour outside. The moment they stepped inside, everything felt different. The temperature dropped immediately. The air inside was thick with an unnatural chill, colder than any rainstorm outside could account for. It didn't feel like an abandoned building. It felt alive, as though the factory was drawing in their warmth, feeding off the very energy they brought with them. It was a sensation they couldn't put their finger on, but it was undeniable. Their breath came out in white puffs, as if they had stepped into a freezer. And then there was the smell. It wasn't just the usual musty odor of old machines and rust. No, this was something worse. It was a nauseating stench, the kind you might associate with rotting food or spoiled meat. It lingered in the air, as though the factory had absorbed years of decay and death into its very walls. At first, they tried to brush it off as part of the factory's old, dilapidated condition. But the longer they stood there, the more the smell seemed to seep into their lungs, choking them. The workers tried to shake off the feeling, pushing forward into the darkened hallway. The lights above flickered, casting long shadows across the floor. The floorboards creaked underfoot, each step echoing in the silence. It was unnerving, the kind of silence that wrapped itself around them and pressed on their ears. There were no sounds of machinery, no hum of electricity, nothing to indicate that this place had ever been alive with work. The entire building felt empty, abandoned, as though the very life had been sucked out of it long ago. Still, they pressed on. The group was a mix of nervousness and determination, each of them hoping that once they got inside and settled, they would forget the oddities of the factory. They walked in a line, with Jiho leading the way, trying to find the foreman or anyone who could guide them to their workstations. The air seemed to grow thicker as they moved deeper into the heart of the factory. There was an unsettling sense of something looming just out of sight. Something watching them from the darkness. It wasn't until they reached the farthest corner of the factory that Mina, a young woman with a calm demeanor, started to feel something was wrong. She had been trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread, but now as she stood near an old machine in the back of the room, she saw something move out of the corner of her eye. It was a shadow, just a fleeting glimpse of something, but it was enough to make her freeze in place. She turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The corner of the room was empty, save for the discarded tools and broken parts of machinery. She told herself it was nothing. The factory was just old, the walls were creaking, and the shadows from the flickering lights were playing tricks on her mind. But as she tried to continue, the feeling didn't fade. It only grew stronger. She kept seeing movement out of the corner of her eye, shadows shifting, figures appearing and vanishing too quickly for her to make out. She looked around the room again, trying to find any explanation, but nothing made sense. Her heart started to race, and she couldn't shake the growing sense of panic. "Are you okay, Mina?" Jiho asked, noticing her sudden stop. "Yeah, I'm fine," Mina replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a little dizzy." The others didn't notice. They were too busy getting settled into their new roles. But Mina couldn't stop the uneasy feeling in her chest. Something wasn't right in this place. She tried to ignore it and focus on her work, but the sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond her sight, gnawed at her. She knew she couldn't be imagining it. The shadows were real, moving in ways that didn't make sense. Late into the night, when the others were distracted with their work, Mina found herself alone again. She walked quietly down the long hallway, trying to get away from the noise of the factory floor. The lights flickered again, casting an eerie glow over the walls. And then there it was again, movement in the corner of her vision. She turned, heart pounding in her chest, but the figure was gone. This time, she didn't brush it off. She was certain she had seen something. A dark shape, tall and thin, with a form that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Her breath caught in her throat, and she found herself frozen in place. Was it a person? Or something else entirely? The factory seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing tighter, as though it was trapping her inside. The fear was almost suffocating. "Mina, come on, let's get back to work." Jiho's voice called from behind her. She spun around quickly, relieved to see him there. He was standing at the end of the hallway, waving her over. But even as she walked back toward him, the unease didn't leave her. In fact, it seemed to follow her, lingering like a dark cloud. She wasn't sure what it was, but she knew it was only a matter of time before the factory showed its true nature. That night, as they worked late into the hours, the factory seemed to grow more alive with every passing minute. The shadows lengthened, the creaks and groans of the building growing louder. Mina wasn't the only one who noticed. Others started to comment on the strange noises, whispers that seemed to come from the walls, low mutterings that no one could explain. The factory had a life of its own, and it wasn't interested in letting anyone leave. But for now, the workers tried to ignore the creeping dread, convincing themselves that it was just their minds playing tricks. Little did they know, the real nightmare had only just begun. The week had crawled by slowly, each day dragging the workers deeper into a sense of unease they couldn't shake. The factory's grip on them was tightening, and the subtle oddities that once seemed like mere quirks had grown into something far more sinister. The shadows that flitted at the edge of their vision seemed to grow darker, and the silence that pervaded the building began to feel heavy, like a suffocating weight. The strange sounds had only increased, scratching noises from the walls, low growls that seemed to echo through the floors. And sometimes, just when you thought you could breathe a little easier, an icy gust of wind would rush through the hallways, despite the closed windows and doors. But the most unsettling change came when one of them went missing. Yoon was a quiet young man who had been working at the factory for just a few days. He was always the first to arrive and the last to leave, never complaining, just doing his job without drawing attention. His face was calm, his movements steady, but there was something about him that made him blend into the background, never causing a ripple in the monotonous flow of the factory's eerie existence. However, that all changed when he vanished without a trace. It happened late on a Friday night, just as the factory's atmosphere grew darker, heavier with each passing hour. The others were finishing up their work, still trying to ignore the uncomfortable stillness in the air. Mina had been working near the old storage room, the one at the far end of the factory that always seemed to be untouched, locked away from prying eyes. She saw June walking towards the door, a slow and deliberate walk, his figure disappearing into the dimness of the hallway. At first, no one thought much of it. June had been there for hours, working on inventory, checking old supplies, nothing out of the ordinary. But as the hours passed and the factory slowly emptied of workers heading home, no one saw him again. The first person to notice was Jiho. He had been working near the front of the factory, cleaning up some leftover equipment, when he realized June hadn't come back. His absence was odd, even by the factory's strange standards. June was always so reliable, so quiet in his routine. He wasn't the type to just disappear. Jiho called out for him, his voice echoing off the walls, but there was no response. He walked toward the storage room, unsure what he would find. The door was cracked open, the dim light from inside casting long shadows on the floor. Jiho peered inside, but found nothing. No sign of June, no sound. Just the lingering smell of dust and the faint echo of his own voice. "June?" Jiho called again, stepping inside. He scanned the room quickly, looking behind boxes, underneath shelves, and through the rows of old machinery. Nothing. It was like June had just vanished into thin air. Jiho checked his watch. It had been nearly 2 hours since he had last seen him. That didn't make sense. By now, June would have returned to the main floor, or at least sent a message. Jiho's gut tightened, his suspicion growing. He walked back to the others, feeling a growing sense of dread. Mina was the first to notice his tense expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. "June's gone," Jiho said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I just checked the storage room. He never came back." The others gathered quickly, their faces reflecting the same unease that had begun to take root in Jiho's heart. They all walked to the storage room, their footsteps echoing unnervingly in the still air. When they reached the door, they hesitated, each of them afraid to cross the threshold. But they had no choice. They pushed the door open, and once again, the room was as empty as it had been earlier. Nothing had changed. "Maybe he just went home," Mina suggested. But even she didn't believe it. No one had seen June leave, and he wouldn't have just walked out without saying anything. The group split up, combing through the factory, checking every corner, every hall. It felt like they were searching for a ghost. The longer they searched, the less sense it made. There were no signs of struggle, no indication that June had been hurt, or that anything out of the ordinary had happened. His belongings were still in his locker, his phone and jacket untouched. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but his empty workspace. Mina's heart pounded in her chest as she stood in front of his locker, staring at the untouched items. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. June wasn't the type to leave without a word. And yet, here they were, left with only his abandoned possessions and a growing sense of terror that gnawed at their insides. The workers spent hours searching, their fear growing with each fruitless attempt to find him. The factory's oppressive silence seemed to press down on them, making it harder to think clearly. It was as if the building itself was watching them, waiting for them to give up. But it wasn't just the mystery of June's disappearance that terrified them. It was the way the factory seemed to be alive, reacting to their presence, feeding off their fear. The air grew colder the longer they stayed. Shadows crept in the corners, stretching across the walls, as though they were reaching for something. Every noise felt too loud, every creak of the floorboards too ominous. The factory had always been strange, but now it felt like it was actively pushing them out, like it didn't want them there anymore. In the morning, the workers gathered at the front entrance, staring at each other in disbelief. June was still missing, and despite their best efforts, no one had heard a word from him. His sudden disappearance felt unnatural, as though something in the factory had claimed him. The boss had been called, but his reaction was not what they had hoped for. He was calm, almost indifferent. He told them it was just another missing person case, something that happened from time to time. He wasn't concerned, but the workers were. They knew something had changed. The factory was alive, and it was hungry. June had been the first, but they feared he wouldn't be the last. The building had claimed him, swallowed him whole, and it was waiting for the next soul to fall into its grasp. As they left the factory that day, the workers could not shake the feeling that the factory was still watching them, waiting for its next opportunity. The factory had always been unsettling, but after June's disappearance, things grew worse. The factory no longer felt like a place of employment. It felt like a living, breathing entity, one that was watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day, as though the air itself was thick with something malevolent, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. The sounds of the factory had always been eerie, creaking floors, groaning pipes, and the occasional hum of machinery. But now, they were different. They were louder, sharper, more insistent. And then there were the voices, whispers that echoed in the empty halls, faint screams that seemed to come from deep within the walls. But when the workers ran to investigate, there was nothing there. Just silence. An empty, cold emptiness. It wasn't long before the machines themselves started to act strange. At first, it was small things. Lights flickering on and off. Machines stopping mid-operation, only to start up again by themselves. But then, it became worse. The old metal grinders that had sat idle for years suddenly roared to life, their rusted teeth spinning at terrifying speeds. Conveyor belts jerked into motion, sending abandoned tools and parts sliding across the floor. The workers tried to shut the machines down, but the controls didn't respond. The buttons stuck and the levers jammed, refusing to move as though they had a mind of their own. The factory was no longer just a place where things were made. It was turning against them. As the machines malfunctioned, the temperature in the factory dropped dramatically. The cold wasn't just the natural chill of an abandoned building. It was an unnatural cold, the kind that seemed to seep into their bones, turning their blood to ice. They tried to keep working, to ignore the growing sense of dread that filled the air, but it became impossible to focus. Every glance around the factory was met with the strange sense of something watching them from the dark corners of the rooms. The walls felt too close, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Then, one night, it happened. A scream shattered the silence of the factory. It was a gut-wrenching, inhuman sound that seemed to come from every direction at once, echoing off the walls and reverberating deep into the workers' bones. The sound was so terrifying that it froze them in place. They looked at each other, wide-eyed, searching for an explanation, but no one had seen anything. There was no... It wasn't just the noises or the strange malfunctions that terrified them. It was the feeling of being watched. The workers would glance up, only to see shadows moving out of the corner of their eyes. Figures that disappeared as soon as they turned to look. It was as though the factory itself was alive, and it was watching them, studying them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The fear became unbearable. No one could sleep. No one could think straight. The air was thick with tension, with the sense that something terrible was about to happen. It wasn't long before the workers started to talk. They shared their experiences, their suspicions, and the chilling stories that had been whispered by the locals. The factory had a dark history, one that no one had ever dared to fully explore. The workers dug into the past of the building, desperate for answers, desperate to understand what they were dealing with. What they found was worse than they could have imagined. The factory had been built decades ago, long before it had fallen into disrepair. Originally, it had been a bustling center of industry, a place of progress and innovation. But as they dug deeper, they uncovered stories of twisted experiments, strange disappearances, and dark rituals that had been performed in the factory's deepest corners. The locals spoke of a time when the factory was not just a place of work. It was a place of sacrifice. It had started with rumors, as all dark tales do. The factory had once been the site of a series of experiments conducted by a group of scientists. They were said to have been interested in harnessing the power of the human soul, experimenting on the workers in ways that could never be fully explained. The whispers said that the factory had been built on an ancient burial ground, a place where the earth itself held dark power. The scientists, eager to push the boundaries of science and the occult, had begun to use the workers as test subjects for their experiments. They would inject them with strange substances, perform horrific surgeries, and then monitor their reactions. The goal was to unlock the secrets of immortality, to find a way to preserve the human soul, and even to separate it from the body. But something went horribly wrong. The experiments grew more extreme as time went on. The scientists became obsessed with their work, pushing the boundaries of ethics and morality. They began performing horrific rituals, using the factory as a site for dark ceremonies. Sacrifices were made, human sacrifices, offered to whatever dark forces had been awakened by their experiments. The workers, once proud and hard-working, began to disappear. Some were taken by the scientists, others simply vanished without a trace. Their souls absorbed into the dark energy that had been awakened in the factory. It wasn't long before the factory's reputation soured. The locals, aware of the strange happenings, began to avoid the area. The factory's workers were never seen again, and those who dared to speak of the events were quickly silenced. But the factory never truly stopped. The experiments had worked, but in a way that no one could have anticipated. The dark energy that had been unleashed still lingered in the factory, a malevolent force that had come to life, feeding on the souls of those who entered. It wasn't just a building, it was a prison, a vessel for something ancient and evil that had been awakened and was now feeding on the fear and suffering of anyone who dared to cross its threshold. The workers realized with growing horror that they weren't just stuck in an abandoned factory. They were trapped in a place that had been designed to devour them. The factory was alive, and it had been waiting for them. They were the latest victims of the twisted experiments that had begun so many years ago. And now, the factory was hungry again. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. Every corner of the building seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. And the workers realized with gut-wrenching certainty that they were no longer just employees. They were prey. The factory had always been alive. It had always been waiting. And now, it was feeding on them, one by one. A factory had become a nightmare. It wasn't just the eerie, unnatural cold that filled the air anymore. It wasn't just the machinery that moved on its own, or the voices in the walls. It wasn't even the growing number of missing workers, one after another, each disappearance more inexplicable than the last. It was the sense that the factory itself was no longer just a place of work or even an abandoned building. It was a living entity, a monstrous force that fed on fear, on souls. The workers had started to disappear at an alarming rate. First, it had been June. Then it was Jiho, who was last seen standing near the old storage room, his eyes wide with fear, as if he had seen something he couldn't explain. After Jiho, there was only silence. One by one, they were taken, leaving Mina, the last remaining worker, alone in the vast, empty halls of the factory. At first, she had tried to ignore it, to convince herself that the others had simply left, that maybe they had gotten scared and run off. But as the days passed, she knew in her gut that it was something far worse than just fear. The factory was claiming them, one by one, and soon she feared it would come for her too. The whispers had started to grow louder too. At night, when the factory was silent, except for the creaking of metal and the faint sound of machinery in the distance, Mina could hear voices. They were soft at first, like whispers, just out of reach, but they became clearer with each passing night. The voices of the lost souls, the workers who had vanished. Their words were twisted and garbled, distorted by years of torment. But there was one message that came through loud and clear. Get out. Run before it takes you too. But Mina couldn't leave. The factory had trapped her. She couldn't explain it, but it felt as though the walls themselves were holding her prisoner. Every time she tried to leave, she would find herself drawn back to the same spot. No matter which door she went through, she would always end up back at the same place. The heart of the factory, where it seemed as though the walls were closing in on her. It was like the factory itself was alive, and it didn't want her to escape. It wanted her to stay. It wanted her to become a part of it. One night, Mina found herself alone again, the factory eerily quiet around her. She had been searching for answers, trying to piece together the truth about what was happening, about the horrible fate that had befallen the others. But every time she thought she was getting close, another piece of the puzzle would disappear. The factory seemed to shift, to change, every time she turned her back. Rooms would disappear. Hallways would bend in impossible ways. No matter how many times she retraced her steps, she always found herself in the same place, lost in the heart of the factory, where the shadows seemed to stretch out of control, and the air was thick with a suffocating invisible force. This time, as she wandered the factory's dark corridors, she noticed something different. A door she had never seen before. It was small, hidden in the corner of the hall, barely visible behind a stack of old crates. At first, she thought it was just another storage room, perhaps one that had been overlooked when the factory was abandoned. But as she approached it, she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. there was something about this door that made her uneasy. It didn't belong. She could feel the darkness that lingered behind it, as though it was hiding something. The very thing that had claimed the others. Her heart hammered in her chest as she reached out to touch the door. It was cold, colder than the rest of the factory, as though it had been frozen in time. The door creaked as she slowly opened it, revealing a hidden room that wasn't on any of the factory's blueprints. It was dark inside, the only light coming from the dim glow of a flickering bulb above. The air was thick, suffocating, and the smell hit her immediately. It was a nauseating stench, something that made her stomach churn, like something had rotted and festered in the corners for years. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, Mina began to make out shapes in the room. The walls were lined with old, rusted tools, blood-stained, twisted devices that looked as though they had been used for something far more sinister than just factory work. She recoiled in horror as she realized what she was looking at. These weren't tools for making things. They were instruments of pain, of torture. Old blades, saws, and shackles were scattered across the floor. Some of them were encrusted with dark stains. Others still slick with something that might have been blood. The air in the room felt charged, as though it had been steeped in misery and suffering for decades. But it was the center of the room that made Mina's blood run cold. There, in the middle of the room, stood a large, rusted machine. It was old, so old, in fact, that it barely resembled anything that might have been used in the factory's original operations. Its jagged teeth gleamed in the dim light, and thick chains hung loosely from the sides. The machine looked like something out of a nightmare, a twisted, monstrous thing that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. Mina could feel its malevolent presence, could feel it calling to her, drawing her in, beckoning her to come closer. As she stepped forward, a cold wind seemed to sweep through the room, causing the chains to rattle against the machine. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. It was as though the factory itself was alive, watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. But there was no turning back now. Mina was already too far in, her curiosity overwhelming the fear that gripped her. She had to understand. She had to know what had happened here. What had caused the factory to become this place of torment, of death? Her fingers trembling, she reached out to touch the machine. Before she could make contact, she heard a voice, a whisper, faint but clear. "Leave, now." Mina spun around, her heart racing, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the blood-stained tools and the rusting machine. But the voice lingered in her mind, echoing through her thoughts. She knew she wasn't alone in this room. She could feel the presence of the lost souls, the ones who had been used, broken, and abandoned by the factory. They were here, in this room, trapped forever, their pain still alive in the very air she breathed. In that moment, Mina understood the terrifying truth. The factory wasn't just a building. It was a trap, an ancient, malevolent force that had been luring innocent souls for decades. The machine in the center of the room wasn't just a tool for manufacturing. It was a device designed for torture, designed to rip apart the soul, to harvest it and feed the factory's insatiable hunger. The workers who had come before her hadn't just disappeared. They had been claimed, sacrificed to whatever. Mina was next. She could feel it now, the cold hands of the factory reaching out for her, pulling her closer to the center of its dark power. But she was too terrified to move. She couldn't run. She couldn't escape. The factory had already claimed her. The whispers of the lost souls grew louder in her ears, warning her, begging her to leave. But it was too late. The machine hummed to life, its gears grinding and twisting as the factory's hunger intensified. Mina's fate had already been sealed. She was trapped in the heart of the death trap, and there was no escaping the horrors that awaited her. The factory was alive, and it had claimed another soul. Mina's heart raced in her chest as the terrifying truth slammed into her like a physical blow. The factory, this place, this nightmare, had been trapping souls for years, maybe even decades. She wasn't just an unlucky worker. She was the latest victim of a horrific cycle that had claimed so many before her. The factory was alive, not in the way machines hummed to life, but in a much darker, more insidious way. It fed on fear. It fed on souls. And now, it was coming for hers. The very walls of the building seemed to breathe with a malevolent force, shifting and warping around her. Every step she took was met with resistance, as though the factory itself was pushing her back, pulling her deeper into its cold, dark core. She could feel it, its hunger, its unyielding desire to claim her like it had claimed the others before her. She turned around, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls, trying to run, to escape. But the factory seemed to shift with every step she took. The doors she had passed just moments ago were now sealed shut, the walls closing in, blocking her path at every turn. The floor beneath her feet groaned and cracked, as though the building itself was alive and angry, its hunger insatiable. As she sprinted through the twisting corridors, Mina's mind raced. She had to get out. There had to be a way. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, her lungs burning from the cold, her body trembling from fear. She could hear it, the whispers of the lost souls, the voices of those who had vanished before her. They echoed in her mind, distant and distorted, like a chorus of desperate cries, all of them trapped in this hellish place, their souls forever bound to the factory. Help me, leave. Before it's too late, the voices pleaded, but they were faint, drowned out by the overwhelming roar of the factory's presence. The machinery groaned, the air thick with an unnatural cold that seeped into her bones. She could feel it, the way the factory was feeding off her fear, twisting it into something darker, more powerful. Her feet stumbled over the broken floorboards, but she pushed forward, desperately trying to reach the exit. But as she ran, she could feel the factory's grip tightening around her. The hallway ahead seemed to stretch impossibly long, the walls narrowing with each step, the shadows lengthening like fingers reaching out to claim her. She turned a corner, but the space in front of her seemed to shift. The door to the outside, nowhere in sight. Panic surged through her as she pounded her fist against the walls, screaming for help, but her voice was swallowed by the factory's oppressive silence, drowned by the deafening hum of machinery and the relentless beat of her own heart. She stumbled backward, gasping for breath, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had to escape. She had to get out. But every way she turned, the walls seemed to close in tighter. She could feel the darkness creeping up behind her, crawling beneath her skin, suffocating her, pulling her back toward the heart of the factory. The air became thick with the stench of decay, the smell of old blood and rusted metal, a scent that seemed to cling to everything in this forsaken place. Then, just when she thought she couldn't take it any longer, she heard it, the sound of the door to the outside, creaking open. Her heart leapt in her chest as she rushed toward the sound, her mind screaming in triumph. The door was just ahead. She was so close. She could feel the fresh air beyond it, the outside world, freedom. But as she reached the door, her hand outstretched toward the handle, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the entire factory. The sound of it echoed in her ears like a death knell. She pulled at the handle, desperate, but it wouldn't budge. It was as though the door was welded shut, locked by some unseen force. Her breath caught in her throat as she pounded her fists against the door, her body racked with fear and frustration. She screamed for help, her voice breaking, but there was no answer. No one to hear her. The factory had her now. The walls around her seemed to press in, closing her off from any hope of escape. The temperature plummeted further, the cold cutting through her like ice. She could hear the sound of the machines beginning to stir, the mechanical whirring growing louder as the gears ground against one another. The factory was awake now, its hunger fully awakened. Suddenly, she heard a sound that sent a jolt of terror through her entire body. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, dragging across the floor. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat as she saw them. the ghostly figures of the workers who had disappeared before her. Their faces were pale, gaunt, their eyes hollow with the despair of being trapped in this nightmare for eternity. They reached out to her, their arms outstretched, their mouths moving, but no sound coming out. "Get out!" they mouthed, their voices lost in the air. "Escape before it's too late." But Mina couldn't move. She couldn't speak. She was frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror. As the workers reached out to her, they were the lucky ones, the ones who had been taken first. They had been trapped in this place for so long that their souls had become part of the factory, bound to it forever. She could see it in their eyes, the endless torment, the pain of being trapped here, caught between the realms of the living and the dead. "Please," Mina whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Please, help me." But the workers didn't respond. They could do nothing but watch as the factory's grip tightened around her, as it pulled her deeper into the heart of its dark power. She turned away from them, feeling the crushing weight of their eyes on her, their silent pleas for her to escape. But it was too late. She wasn't getting out. The machines roared to life behind her, the sound of metal grinding against metal filling the air. She could hear the deep, growling hum of the factory, like a living beast ready to strike. She turned to face the machine in the center of the room, the one she had seen earlier, the one that had been waiting for her. The rusted gears began to turn, the chains rattling as they began to move, the machine awakening from its slumber. Mina's heart hammered in her chest as she took one last look at the door, her last chance at freedom. It was still shut, locked by something far more powerful than she could understand. She turned back to the machine, the sound of its whirring growing louder, deafening. She couldn't escape. The factory had her now. It had always had her, from the moment she stepped inside its cursed walls. The last thing Mina heard was the mechanical grind of the machine, followed by a final, horrifying scream. A scream that echoed through the halls of the factory, joining the voices of the others who had come before her. And then everything went black.